Hi, everyone. I'm joined today by Dr. Vaish Sarathy. Vaish is a functional nutrition educator. She specializes in children with chronic health conditions. So very welcome, Vaish. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, Jagjit. Thanks for inviting me. I'm honored to be here.
Thank you. So Vash, why don't we just start by you telling us about your journey into becoming a nutritionist, and thereby just focusing also on children and with children with chronic illnesses. So how did this whole thing come about?
Yeah, and you might know that I am by training and by education a chemist, and I have a PhD in environmental chemistry. My son, Sid, who's 13 now, was born with Down syndrome and later diagnosed with autism. And this was around the time that I was working for Intel as an environmental engineer. And to be a little bit more involved in his care, I had at the time left Intel. My son was struggling with a lot of gut issues, which when your child has disabilities, regardless of what they are, they might be a learning disability, Down syndrome, autism, cerebral palsy, something more significantly impacting their life, or something less, even something like ADHD. A lot of health issues are kind of pushed under the rug because of what I call the diagnostic hammer, where you use a diagnosis to justify the health issue. Oh, your child is constipated because they have Down syndrome, or your child cannot focus because they have autism, because they have ADHD. Whereas this kind of reasoning doesn't really, it's just circular logic. It doesn't mean anything. And so we have a lot of children with diagnoses today. There are more children with diagnoses than without. And anyway, at this time, what I was seeing was that my son had a lot of gut issues that are being swept under the rug by his mainstream professionals because they actually didn't have the tools to deal with it. So at the time, I went hunting for what is now called functional medicine professionals. At the time, most of them were called biomed doctors, but the people under the alternative medicine umbrella. And as I was working with functional nutritionists, I figured that given my chemistry background and given my understanding of biochemistry, I was thinking this is something I can do myself. And so I trained and I kept training with the same people that I was consulting with at the time. My mentor's name is Andrea Nakayama. And I have been just learning under her for many years now. And then eventually I started practicing because it is a very important tool today when nutrition is extremely misunderstood and misapplied for children, especially children with disabilities.
Mm-hmm. That's really good. Great to know, Ash. And yeah, given that you've had a personal journey, it just, kind of shows how much, the passion that goes into it. Thank you so much for that. So, Vash, there's a few questions that we're going to discuss. The first one that comes up is about sugar and dairy. So, how do you go about to discuss sugar and dairy in kids' nutrition? What kind of balance is there to be strived?
I always get very, it's hard for me to answer questions about balance because the word balance itself is very misunderstood in nutrition because we understand balance as moderation. And it's not, when you're dealing with an inflammatory food, balance is not always moderation. So coming to the point, dairy in the form that it's had today can be extremely inflammatory to a significantly large proportion of children. So if your child is struggling with frequent infections, constipation, bloating, other digestive issues, including diarrhea, I would even focus issues, brain fog. If you feel like your child is really not on as much on top of things as you would like them to be, I strongly encourage removing dairy because parents can be so resistant to it. I would say that try it out for a short time. So generally, when we're removing things, we want to be a little strict during the time of removal, because if you're having 95% dairy free, that doesn't really do the trick. Okay, it might help a little bit, but it's not going to give you the aha moment. Oh my God, dairy is what's doing this, right? So it's always good to be a little strict when you're removing it. So in my practice, because I work predominantly with children with disabilities, it's sort of a non-negotiable that we don't do dairy, at least for the time that they're consulting with me. And if it turns out that they can tolerate it fine, they bring it in, everything is okay, they're having organic dairy and there's no hormones in there, and then that's fine. There are some people who can tolerate dairy. It happens. It's not as many as you think, but it's possible. Sugar too, refined sugar, again, removing refined sugar is a non-negotiable. Sugar can cause a host of problems, from bacterial overgrowth to blood sugar imbalances. There's more to nutrient deficiencies. There's to focus issues to which are usually due to the blood sugar imbalance. So removing refined, and when I say refined sugar, I'm talking about white sugar, is I consider it one of the diet non-negotiables. So, but you don't have to be sugar-free. You can bring in raw honey, some good sources of jaggery, or depending on, or coconut sugar, or sometimes maple syrup too. So there are unrefined forms of sugar that are available. You don't want to overindulge on a ton of them. We do have a society that's very attached to its sugar. And if you look at traditional societies and the way they ate, we always say that we ate sugar traditionally as Indians. We didn't eat that much sugar. So if I look at the diet that my grandma ate, my mother lists the foods that she ate, and there were like very few foods that were sweetened on a daily basis. So the kheer and the payasam and the sweets were very occasional, meant for celebratory events. And we're kind of in this mode of celebration all the time right now. So we're eating like we're in a festival every day, right? So, and so really low moderation, again, not what is generally considered as moderation, but take what you think of as moderation and dial it down like 10 times. Yeah. So very careful sugar, but always unrefined.
Yeah. So, Vash, I was going to ask you this, and I often think about this. I'm personally trying dairy-free diet, for example. But, when you traditionally in the South Asian families, we're like, oh, but dairy is amazing. Like, we always get this from our parents' generation or their grandparents. So, back home, like back in India, for example, dairy was such a, kind of, you are supposed to have milk in the morning and at night, and, lots of dairy foods. Is it that is it something that's changing in us, or is it that the milk quality or the dairy quality is different? What is it?
Both. But yes, you're right. In Ayurvedically, wheat and dairy are miracle foods. They're the foods of, they're divine foods. Both of them are extremely what's called vata balancing. So they're really supposed to be calming. And they've turned out to be the most inflammatory foods in our diet right now, both wheat and dairy. And yes, dairy is especially warm. But remember that even in India, when they drank dairy traditionally, you may not have known it, but it was supposed to be organic, and it was supposed to be warmed up, boiled, heated with spices. There was a certain way. We never drank cold milk. That has never been a thing in India. So if you are so attached to dairy, I would really stick, not you, I mean, if one is so attached to dairy, I would still recommend that you boil it, warm it with spices, and have it the way that, and not load it with sugar. But to answer your question, throughout the world, methods of farming have changed. Cows are no longer really grass-fed. They're in confined lot operations. They are in extremely stressful situations because there's just no way we can meet the daily demands of, billions of people by letting cows graze freely. We just don't have the space. So ideally, if you had grass-fed cows that were not hybridized, that were the so-called desi cows, and they were producing milk that's known as A2 milk, which is a certain type of protein found in milk. Mm-hmm. That milk, and they were not, the grass that they ate was not loaded with pesticides, and the cows were not injected with hormones, then in that ideal situation, the milk would be fine. And there is that kind of ideal milk. It's expensive, but that milk is available, which is A2, organic, grass-fed. What else? Ideally not homogenized, right? So where the cream separates from the top. So if all of these boxes are checked, then sure, yeah, you can, the milk is fine. But we're also in an environment where our gut health, our digestive ability has been dialed down several notches because of the continuous onslaught of not dairy, but like pesticides from other places. We by the fact that we're exposed to so many antibiotics through food and through direct consumption of antibiotics, as our microbiome, the bacteria in our gut that's responsible, that really supports digestion, is so significantly less diverse than it used to be. I mean, there are thousands of species that are less. People have done comparisons with one of the most pristine microbiomes in the world, which is the Hadza tribe in, I hope I'm saying that right, in Africa, which is a hunter-gatherer tribe. And there was something called the Gut Microbiome Project, or was it the Human Gut Project? Okay, I got something wrong there, but at any rate, it was a hunter-gatherer tribe in Africa that they're because they are hunter-gatherers, because they're still living in a very pristine lifestyle, their microbiome is a little bit untouched. And when you compare it with the Western microbiome, we have significantly less diversity, which directly correlates with disease, all sorts of disease. You can say or dysfunction. We can say ADHD, but we can also say rheumatoid arthritis. We can say high cholesterol. We know that these are all, I went off on a tangent here, but bringing us back to the point, our guts are not the guts of our ancestors. Our milk is not the milk of our ancestors. And we're living in this toxic combination of a weak digestion and terrible milk, which means we can't break down the milk that we're drinking. Yeah. When you can't break down the milk that you're drinking, there's a protein called casein in milk. Yeah. The undigested casein is addictive and causes significant gut inflammation.
Okay, that's really, really interesting. Thank you so much. And before we go to our next question, I've got another question that's just popped in my head. So, ghee, we say clarified butters. So, my impression is that because it's gone through a process which kind of kills the proteins, well, in a way disintegrates or damages the protein, and casein being one of them. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So is ghee kind of okay, even if you're suggesting a dairy-free diet?
Yes, okay. Because ghee is the process of filtration, and the way that we clarify because ghee is pure fat. Yeah. The way that ghee is traditionally made removes all the protein. So technically, if filtered well, so if you're doing it at home, make sure you go through at least a few steps of filtration. I'm not an expert on how many times you have to filter, but I would recommend at least 2 or 3 times. I've heard some Ayurvedic experts say 7 times. I don't know, but do it more than once, right? Okay. Just make sure you can tell the separation, the junk that's left over when you make ghee. Just make sure that stuff is in there. Okay. Ghee is not just fine. Ghee is actually awesome. So even if you are dairy free, I strongly recommend ghee. But remember that hormones and pesticides and the stuff that we're afraid of in milk can accumulate in fat. So if you are getting ghee, it's significantly important that it's organic. And I know that this can become a very elitist thing to say because it's expensive, but then unfortunately a lot of hormones and pesticides are fat soluble. So we do want to be careful there. Mm-hmm. So you want to make sure the ghee is coming from butter that's well sourced, and that the cows have not had hormones, and they're antibiotic free, because when you're raising cows in very stringent and constrained conditions, you have to give them antibiotics, because otherwise they're going to fall sick all the time. Yeah. And so it's not a very profitable situation for the farmers. So guess where those antibiotics are landing up? In your gut, destroying your bacteria, right? So there are a few caveats, and but ghee is amazing. Ghee has short chain fatty acids that are extremely supportive to gut health. So I have a ton of ghee every day, and I love ghee. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for clarifying that, Vaish. Yeah. So the next question that we have, are there any certain types of foods that help with constipation? We're talking about obviously children's nutrition. So are there any foods that particularly help?
Yeah, and I get asked this question a lot, Jagjit, and I want to clarify that a little bit, because we're often looking for a magic bullet to solve constipation. And in those days, in an Ayurvedic lifestyle in India, when everything was going right, when we're living in the ideal environment, we could say, oh, eat a ripe banana, and it will help with constipation. Eat oatmeal and it'll help with constipation. But right now we're looking at it in the reverse, because constipation isn't a one-off event for most kids we're looking for help with. I'm assuming we're talking about kids, but it doesn't matter. The methodology is the same. It's what is causing the constipations. I want parents to step back a little bit. So is your kid having a lot of inflammatory foods? If they're having a ton of wheat, dairy, and sugar, see if you can step back from those a little bit and see if the constipation resolves. And if that is not the case, then there are a few supplements that I like. I like magnesium citrate, and it really helps get things moving. I like, of course, you need to make sure you have sufficient fiber in your diet, both soluble and insoluble. So things like oatmeal, chia seeds, flax. When you're doing that, you have to make sure you have tons of water because fiber doesn't work if you don't get enough water. So different kinds of fiber, not just fiber, but fiber from different nuts and seeds, especially what they call the mucilaginous seeds, stuff that are, I don't know if you've touched like cooked oatmeal or chia seeds, the sliminess. Those foods are really good for movement along your digestive tract. And bhindi, okra. But honestly, any vegetable that, if you bring in the fiber, right? So bring in whole grains, whole lentils, and vegetables. So back it up to a whole foods diet. We're no longer in a situation where there are a few magic foods that help, but a consistent lifestyle where you're eating whole foods predominantly and avoiding inflammatory foods is your first go-to. That doesn't work, if you need to go tomorrow, I would stay away from stimulating laxatives. My two favorite, these are not laxatives, but they're kind of gut toners, are, well, magnesium citrate is a laxative. My two favorites are magnesium citrate and Triphala, which is an Ayurvedic formulation. My observation through the help of one of my clients is that, I don't know if you've had Triphala, it's pretty bitter, but I feel like capsules don't work as well. You need to taste the Triphala. So I've moved from a capsule to, it's a bitter herb, unfortunately, but the bitter taste can really stimulate a lot of digestion and movement along your gut. So one of the things where, this is a tangent, but also not a tangent because it directly relates to constipation, is your child having bitter foods? We're in a sweet overdosed world. We're in a saccharin sweet world today. And this is not healthy, because if you talk to your grandmother or your great grandmother, if you can, or at least talk to people who know their great grandmothers, right? And you'll notice that everybody had a little bit of karela, bitter gourd, or something, bitter vegetables, mustard greens. There was always something that had like this astringent bitter taste. And there's a lot of research on bitter receptors in your tongue, which with the minute you taste bitter, your body is programmed to release enzymes to just stimulate the whole process of digestion and movement. Remember, constipation means movement, right? Your intestines are not moving. So that's another thing. So to sum it up, I would say whole foods, remove inflammatory foods like dairy, sugar, and wheat, if possible, and eat bitter foods.
Very interesting. Thank you, Vaish. So now we come to the next question, which is there a diet that is better for kids?
Same thing. Yeah, so as mentioned above, anti-inflammatory, which means remove the most common sources of inflammation. This can be any food sensitivity, but it's predominantly dairy. And sugar is inflammatory. White sugar is inflammatory to most people. Consider removal of wheat as well. It is no longer a fad diet to remove wheat. There are significantly more and more number of kids that are sensitive to wheat. So try it out and see if it works for you. And whole foods. White rice is not a whole food. White flour, maida, is not a whole food. White anything except cauliflower is generally not a whole food.
Okay. And then for sugar, some people I've seen would use honey, for example, like regular honey or maybe raw honey. Is that really better than sugar or not really?
Raw honey is, I am a little biased towards raw honey. There's a lot of, this is through Ayurvedic doctors that I've talked to, that there's a lot of, what should I say? Ayurveda is very strictly against anything but raw honey. So cooked honey is supposed to be a toxin. So we don't want pasteurized honey. It's really surprising that a lot of honey that we see in India, which is the seat of Ayurveda, is pasteurized. But nowadays you can get a lot of raw honey in India too. So, and everywhere, honestly, not just India. So raw honey is great because it's the only whole food sweetener that we have. If you think about it, everything else is processed. Raw honey is the only food that is coming from the source to your plate. I mean, we could say that the bees are processing it, but at least it's the bees that are processing it and not us, right? So it's yes, they're collecting the nectar and all of that, but it is the only whole food. White sugar is obviously not whole, but even jaggery undergoes processing by human beings to a significant level. And coconut sugar, maple syrup, nothing exists in nature like that. Even maple syrup, the one we drink, is not direct from the sap. It's significantly processed further. So raw honey contains a lot of enzymes, trace minerals, can actually help lower blood sugar according to some studies. It is, there's just, I would go to PubMed.com and just put in raw honey. It's antibacterial, it's antiviral, it It can help with allergies because it contains pollen, low doses of pollen that a lot of people, when you go to doctors that, well, at least naturopaths, and one of the first medicines that they'll give you if you have significant allergies is to have local raw honey, which contains the pollen from your region. So raw honey is a magic food. I'm a huge fan of raw honey.
Yeah. And is it okay to have it in hot beverages as well? Or I've heard that, good.
I do, because I love it in my chai, but they say that no. So I'll leave that to, I mean, like, maybe not too hot. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And how are diet and focus related again in context of children?
Well, I'll isolate it to one point. One of the most significant things that I've seen in my clients that affects moods and focus is blood sugar imbalance, which is that when you eat a meal, your blood sugar is supposed to spike. Okay, and then it slowly falls down. Okay, now this can be a peak like this, or it can be a slow peak like this. You want a slow peak. When you have a sharp peak, the drop is equally precipitous. It's equally sharp. Then what happens is that drop can suddenly tank your energy and you don't know it. It's what we call hangry, right? So when we say people are hangry, shouldn't be hangry. Okay, if you're hangry, you've had a steep drop in your blood sugar. And what that does to children is that they don't recognize that. So that can relate to mood issues, that can be terrible for focus. Okay, so in order to have focus, you need to have a steady flow of blood sugar. So when that happens is when you eat food that are high in protein, fiber, and fat, and low in simple carbs or refined carbs, especially, right? So if you're eating cereal for breakfast with milk, it's like the worst breakfast in the world in terms of blood sugar, right? So no matter how fortified your cereal is extremely processed, and every bite is going boom, boom, it's spiking your blood sugar with equal drops. So yeah, so if you have an omelette for breakfast or a dosa or an idli for breakfast, right? So those are very stabilizing foods for breakfast, or even oatmeal. I actually like dosa and idlis way more than oatmeal. If anybody's afraid of dosas and idlis, considering them, even though we use white rice there, because it is fermented, it has a much different effect on your blood sugar. Fermentation uses carbs, so you no longer have sharp spikes. Dosa and idli are, again, any fermented food. I mean, there might be other fermented foods in other parts of the country. They're all, you can lump them under superfoods.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting as well. And what would you say, like, in South Asian families, for example, what kind of flour would be good? We constantly make chapatis and stuff. So I've heard about, is it millet flour? What kind of other flours are good, which are gluten-free?
I would rotate. So we don't get, if we are South Asian families that are living outside India, we really don't get the variety of millets that Indians get. Millet is, actually don't know if millets are native to India, but the whole millet revolution in India, when I was in Chennai a few years ago, I ate at this millet restaurant. I was just amazed at how good the chapatis were. I think they might have added a little wheat flour to them, but regardless, but it was because you have to knead them and all that. But just like they made everything with millets, but everything was made with a different millet. So we don't want to continuously eat just one type of millet. I know millets are very big, but if you can source different types, great. But we're actually, as a continent, we have amazing diversity of millet. So I would do the regular, what's it called? Pearl millet, I think. But then also, I don't know which one that falls under, but jowar, bajra, ragi, even there you have 3 types of millets. And then there's quinoa. Well, quinoa is not traditional, but amaranth is traditional. And buckwheat is also a traditional grain. Now, it's not a millet, but it's a traditional grain, and it's called different it has different names in different languages. We're eating a lot of buckwheat because it's a little bit more pliable. It looks ugly. It's dark brown. It doesn't look appetizing as a chapati, but it's a beautiful, you want, like, if you're ever making a puri, it's better than the other grains because it's easier to knead and it puffs up well. And unfortunately, it does require a little bit of skill to make chapatis with these grains because they don't have the gluten, and the word gluten comes from glue, which means to bind. So wheat is just fantastic for binding. So Yeah, I would say rotate. Maybe use rice flour if you need, and to get the binding in. But rotate. It's use all of the above that I said, and if you have other grains that I haven't mentioned, use those as well. But rotate, rotate, rotate. And I think oats and rice. A lot of people use oats and rice for binding. Some people even use eggs for binding. If the idea of eggs in your chapati doesn't gross you out, go for that.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. I think we've kind of discussed this question, but can mood be affected by food? So I guess you talked about it briefly, but is there anything else you would like to add to it?
No, I'm going to say yes. So yes, everything I said about blood sugar. There are other factors and nutrient deficiencies. There are, a lot of your neurotransmitters are your gut is the source. Your gut is the home for more neurotransmitters than your brain is. So your gut is your second brain, actually. So if you have an inflamed gut, which can happen due to inflammatory foods, your mood is going to be affected. Anybody that's been constipated for 3 days knows that they feel like, if I say the S word, that would be a terrible pun here. But so anyway, but you know what you feel like. So you're cranky, you're irritated, and anything like if you're bloated, you can't think straight. I've had days when like, I feel very full, and like no matter what I eat, or if you feel nauseous, anybody that's been through a first trimester of pregnancy and is nauseous all the time knows how irritating that feeling of nausea is. So we know that there are nerves that go from the gut to the brain constantly, right? There's the vagus nerve, this predominant nerve that goes back and forth. It's your primary highway from the gut to the brain. It is impossible to have a good mood with an inflamed gut. It's very hard. So I would say remove the blame from if there's anxiety, depression, anger, aggression, like your child's really obstinate, stubborn. Look at the food.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been so informative, Vash. Thank you so much. And I'm so excited to share this with everybody. And I'm sure there will be some follow-up questions, which we can discuss on another chat, or, I will be in touch with you. But really, really, thank you so much. It's been so, so great to hear some really, really great insights. And personally as well, for me, it's always a, learning session, and I've learned so much today. Thank you so much for your time and, discussing all these points with us today.
Thank you, Jagjit. Nice talking to you too. Thanks.
Same. Take care, Vash. Speak soon. Bye-bye.